Hey guys, what's up? Sean with Westcott Designs here. Today I'm going to be showing you how to install our Westcott Designs Lift Kit for the new Tacomas. It's going to be doing 2.5 inch in the front and 3/4 inch in the rear. So let's go. You want to at least have enough to get underneath here, because you got to take off the 2 bolts from the lower control arm, which those guys are going to be a 22mm. And then we're going to remove the sway bar, which is 19mm. And then we're going to take off the shock, which that itself is a 22mm as well. As far as the order of removing stuff, doesn't really matter the way you take it off. Make sure you have a breaker bar handy. Sometimes these guys get locked up in there. With these guys too, when they get seized, what I like to do with the breaker bar is kind of get them tighter, and then it helps it, as far as what I've learned, is it helps it break it loose if you can get it to pull tight and then break it loose again. So you want to use a 24mm. Ratcheting wrench is probably the easiest route to go if you have a long one, because it gives you more leverage. But you're going to want to break the cam bolts loose in order to get the lower control arm to drop down. You don't need to take them all the way off, but you want to get them loose enough that it releases that pressure. And same thing with the shock. Once you have that loosened, just be cautious, because the lower control arm, if it is loose enough, it will just swing right down. So always hold up on it and just work it out. And then there you go. Now you can get your shock out. You're gonna have 4 bolts up top that are 14mm. These guys are fairly easy to break loose. It's more so just awkward getting in there, but ratcheting wrench is going to be your best friend on this one. There's 4 of them. And once you break them loose, you can spin them by hand. It gets a little tight because back in here there's a sensor bracket. So I always take off the one closest to the cab and then the back 2 first, and then I'll leave the one closest to the front on. And what I like to do is I'll break it loose to get the shock ready to come out, so that way I can still release it by hand. So what I like to do is I'll hold up pressure on the bottom of it so I can get that last nut off. Once you get that guy off, the shock will just drop down. Sometimes you have to maneuver, but it just slides out in between the tie rod and the CV axle. All right, so what I like to do too is once I pull it out, usually keep a marker on hand, and you want to mark on the top hat and on the spring itself and down on the base. You can use a marker, paint pen, whatever you feel like. That's just to make sure that the orientation of how you pulled it out is how it's going to go back in. Because once you put the spring compressors on and you pull everything apart, you don't want anything to rotate and twist. This base that goes into the lower control arm, if it's clocked out from the lower control arm, it's not easy to turn back into place once you have everything compressed back together. Any kind of spring compressors will work. These guys are just a little bit easier to maneuver and mess with, but when you compress it, you just want to make sure that you have even amount of force on both sides. So what I like to do is I'll get that one tightened just enough to where it's not playing around, And you'll see it. I mean, it's gonna kick at an angle on these. It happens no matter what. The other one, as soon as you put it on, it'll kick the other direction. You want to try to make sure that they're both compressing evenly on each side. Once you get them going, you just kind of go back and forth on them. And you want to get them to where it's just loose enough that you can get this thing out. For this guy, it's a 19mm up top. Sometimes you can break it loose with an impact. Other times you have to use a ratcheting wrench and use like a crescent wrench or another wrench that fits, because this is keyed right here. So it makes it easier so the whole shaft doesn't rotate. See, it breaks it loose, but it keeps spinning. So we'll get the ratcheting wrench here. Let's use a crescent wrench on this guy. So you get it loose enough, pull it off by hand. Top hat comes off along with the dust sleeve. Just remember your orientation and your markings on them as you pull them off. Try to leave your spring sitting exactly how you took it off, because you don't want it to get rotated or anything. Now on these guys, this is where the fun is for these, on the newer Tacomas. You're gonna want to get yourself advice if you don't have one. And it's got this little retaining ring in here. So this guy has a little clip on the inside. So what you want to do is try to find a wrench or something that slides over it. And basically you're just going to hammer it off and go kind of in a circular motion as to not damage anything. You want to use like an 11/16. Yeah. So that'll kind of help not damage that ring. Getting it off is a lot harder than putting it back on too. But all you do is work your way around. And do what you can not to damage the shaft. Just like that. Once you have that off, now it's time to get the seat for the spring off. Just as easy as hitting it. As far as this plastic piece on here, you can use this guy and just pop it all off. All right, now we have our Westcott Designs preload collar here that we're gonna be installing. This guy's just gonna slide right back on, sits freely and spins, so it makes it easy to get the orientation correct on it. We're gonna install the cap again, just this guy. Just lightly tap it. You'll know when it sits. It'll sound pretty flush there. Okay, now we're gonna be putting this guy back on. This guy going back on, super easy. You're gonna wanna put your shock back in the vise. Same thing with your wrench here. Slide it over. Work around in circular motion. Doesn't take a whole lot to get it to seat, but you just want to make sure it's back in place and sitting nice and flush in there. Once you have that on, Go ahead and slide it back in the spring. You want to make sure that the orientation of this guy is sitting up flush against the spring there. And you want to make sure that you're keeping your shock in line with your other marks that you made on the spring and the top hat. So top hat goes back on, look for your mark, line it up. What you'll often run into when you're doing these things, to compress the spring to get it off, doesn't take a whole lot, but in order to get everything back in place, you're gonna have to compress the spring more. So once again, just work side to side. Once you get enough thread on there, you can get your nut on. Make sure your marks are all lined up again. What I like to do is just get it tight enough to where I can go back on and do everything else by hand. That way you can grab the shock and make sure it's not rotating, because it will end up spinning and changing that orientation of your lines again. Once you get everything nice and tight, everything's lined back up, still in the same orientation, you can go ahead and pull your spring compressors off. That you're gonna do in the same style. You don't wanna take one off completely, you wanna do it side by side, a little bit at a time. All right, and there you have it. Preload collar installed. Now we can go toss it back in the vehicle. All right, so what you want to do is make sure you're putting some Loctite back on these guys. Then what I like to do is I'll just grab one of the nuts, keep it handy, make it easier to install this. It goes back in the same exact way that it came out. So you just come up under here, if it would work with me. I'll just get that one hand tight, just enough to hold it in, then you can place the other nuts on top. Same thing, I'll just get them on by hand. You can kind of lift up on the shock, get it higher up there for you. All right, so for this pry bar up top, what you're gonna wanna do is go in between the upper control arm and the spring to get kind of that down force on the spindle. This guy, you have to kind of move around, get a little bit of downward pressure on it. This guy just hooks in there, and it'll give you enough leverage to kind of work down with it. So as you can see, we got a decent amount of play in this guy. But while you're holding pressure down on that, is when you gotta come down here and try to get all of this to line up. And it's easier if the steering's straighter on it. You gotta basically have 3 hands here to get this going. It's better if you can get these guys sitting flush with each other so there's not a gap. But sometimes there's just not enough leverage or enough stiffness within this guy to get it to sit. Same thing on the other side. If you have to, you can take the crowbar out, that pry bar. So I'll just use my socket to make sure that it's going in nice and smooth, it's not cross-threading. And once you're sure that these guys are moving nice and smooth, I mean, as you can tell, I'm twisting it pretty easy by hand. You can go ahead, kind of work side to side with these guys. Sway bar, the 19 mil. This guy and the two lower bolts are the 22 millimeter. The last thing you're going to want to do is those two lower control arm nuts that we loosen, get those guys tightened back up. As soon as you get done with this, you're going to want to take it over to an alignment shop, or if you have a shop doing it and they have an alignment rack, it'll get taken right away. Now we're going to bump onto the rear. So what you're going to want to do is there's three things you're going to want to remove. So we've got a little 12 millimeter head bolt in here that you're going to want to take off this bracket so you can get enough movement to drop. You're going to be using a 19 millimeter to get the shock on top out, and then a 17 mil to get the rear sway bar out. You got this little spot up here you can get a crescent wrench on. You just got to work on breaking that guy loose. And depending on the year, make, and model, for this guy, what I would suggest, on these newer ones, it's not so much of a problem, but soak everything with WD-40 and try to help break it loose. Even on some of these newer guys, these guys get seized up, and then it'll just create an issue where you're spending hours trying to get this nut off, and it's just not going to go well. And that guy you can just kind of leave hanging there. And it's going to be the same process on both sides. And this guy just pops out and swings out of the way. All right, so one of these guys, if you have a lift, is going to become your best friend for this process. What you want to do, just make sure you got enough pressure pushing up on that rear axle there, because what's going to happen is once you have everything kind of disconnected, as soon as you go to pull this shock out, it'll start to drop. Now note with the sway bar, what you're going to want to do is disconnect the other side as well. It'll give you just a little bit more play as far as the drop, because when we go to put that rear puck in, it is going to need some extra space and you're going to have to kind of play with it a little bit. If you don't have a lift or you don't have one of these jacks available, if you're doing stuff on the ground, you're going to want to just make sure that you got the truck high enough up on jack stands, and you can use just a regular jack underneath this to kind of give you that leverage of the up and down that you need to get the new puck in. So now all I'm going to do take this top nut off, pull out the spacer. Once you have that out, now you can just slowly drop everything down. And this guy, the shock is going to have a lot of force forward on it. I mean, you can see it's easy enough to move, but as you're pulling it out, what I like to do to make sure I don't damage the threads is I'll just kind of pull it back a little bit, make sure it's not rubbing up on anything. And I'll just kind of swing it forward there, get it out of the way. So as you can tell, this thing's got a decent amount of play in it now. Gives you enough room to work with. So getting this guy out, pretty simple. A lot of times that rubber boot that's up top gets stuck on there. You just kind of twist it around a little bit and it'll pop off. You can tell it's even tight just getting the factory spring out. But it's going to be the spring. You got this little rubber boot in here. And then what we'll be doing is taking our Westcott Designs rear puck. And it's as simple as just dropping it in place. And note, if this guy is really dirty, I mean, you obviously want to clean it off, make sure that there's no heavy debris in there. It just pops in like that. There is a little section in here that this is going to sit. As you can see, it kind of sits down. There's just this little groove inside there that it's going to sit in. So as you're putting it in, that's going to be the biggest thing, is making sure it's seated in there. You're just going to want to go at an angle. And this guy's going to just be pushing up on the spring. What'll happen is this little plastic cover that's on the spring, as you go to put it on, it'll like to fold over and fold in. You don't have to worry too much about that, because once it's in place, you got plenty of room to kind of maneuver it around and get it seated back into its position. As you kind of rotate, it has its little home, and you can kind of feel it once it sits in its place, and it won't want to go any further. So as I'm twisting it, it'll start to just lift the spring out. So it's got its little home that'll sit. Start going back up with it. I just like to put a little bit of pressure to make sure that the spring, is seated. Up here is seated, which you can even see from the inside of it. It's sitting nice and pretty in there. Just reverse everything. What I like to do, get this guy back in. Same thing, just holding that pressure back on it. Just making sure we're not damaging the threads as we're going back up with it. So what I like to do is, I don't want to put too much pressure on this, so I still have the ability to move it around. Because if you see, this guy has that little tab on it. This side is going to be going down towards the shock through the bracket. That there will be an opening that this guy will seat directly into. So the smooth side is going to be the top side of that. And this guy, just pop on. I like to make sure, like I said, I have the shock loose, so that way I can get this guy seated in its home. You'll feel it once it's in there. It ain't going anywhere. Put that nut back on top. And you'll feel it hit a point where it'll just start to kind of spin the shaft. So what I'll do, I'll just grab my crescent wrench, get it slid back on there, and just give it a nice little extra crank there. And the sway bar, the easiest thing to do is still just leave it off until you've got the other side completed, because like I said, it helps with the axle kind of drooping down. As far as the shock being mounted back in place on this side, it's not going to affect, just because the way that it pivots, but that sway bar will affect the pivot on it. Don't forget to attach your bracket back here. What you're going to want to do is put this bracket back in place, because what will happen, the reason I take this off is this guy could potentially bind depending on how much force you have to come down with to get this spring back in place. So it's just a safe bet to prevent any damage to any of your wiring, to just disconnect this. All right, so now that we've concluded our install of our preload collar up front and then our rear puck, now we can go ahead and get the wheels and tires installed. So what we're gonna wanna do is we need to remove some panels up front, dependent on the tire size that you run and the wheel offset that you have. For this truck in specific, we are running 35s on it. So front plastic piece is gonna have to come off, as well as in the rear back here, we have our mud flap that we have to take off. This panel, and behind this panel, we have 3 17mm bolts that we have to take off, and there's a plate behind there that comes off as well. For everything else up here, it's gonna be 10mm bolts that run all the way across that piece. And then there's one on the back side. And these guys come off pretty easy. It's just, you get a flathead screwdriver in there. You want to play it extra safe, get one of these guys, little tab remover. this guy, just lift up. It's got little hooks on the back side of it that hook into it. So I have to lift up and pull out for it. The longer extension you have for this front piece, the easier it is to take it off. All right, so after you've gotten that front piece out, there's still some trim in here for the inner fender liner. You're gonna wanna utilize those screws and put them back in place so you don't have this thing moving around. So depending on the tire size too, if you have to trim out this front inner fender liner, those two bolts will not need to be replaced. All right, so now that we got the wheels and tires on, everything's all set for it. That wraps up our kit for the TRD Pro and our Sport kits. Total, it does 2.5 inch on the front and 3/4 inch lift on the rear, which should level it out and make it look nice and clean.